The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
All right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. Today, we are joined by fellow Trontonian, or fellow Trontonian to me, at least, our live playing intellectual renaissance man, Peter Jones. Peter's an associate professor at OCAD University and teaches at the Strategic Foresight Innovation Program there. He's the founder and chair of Relating Systems Thinking and Design Symposium. And Peter, this is his second time. I think it's the second time he's been here as a guest multiple times, or at least in the audience. I think this is his second session here at the Stoa. And Peter and I have been discussing of him doing a series here called The Situation, kind of like a sense-making series of our collective situation. And so this is sort of a one-off of that kind of potential series. And today's title is going to be The Situation, Sense-Making, the Pluriverse between Design and Dasein. And how today's going to work, it's going to be a standard old school Stoa session. I'm going to take Peter in a moment. He's going to share his thoughts for around 30 minutes. And then if you have any questions anytime throughout, just put them in the chat. I'll call on you. You can unmute yourself during the Q&A portion. You can ask your question to Peter. If you don't want to be on YouTube, just indicate that and I'll read your question on your behalf. We're here for roughly 16 minutes in total. So that being said, I will take Peter in. Welcome back to the Stoa, my friend. Oh, you're on mute. There you go.
How's that? Okay.
That's good. Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for the kind introduction. Thanks for joining me today. I'd like to talk about the situation as a metaphor for the meta-crisis. The meta-crisis has been an ongoing theme in the Stoa. The situation is a way that I've looked at the way in which crises come to life, in which we interact and deal with them, and the way that we bring aspects of design and our own experience into a place where we can make sense of, take action for, and have something to say in the face of overwhelming complexity, in the face of complex situations, and in the shape of different sense-making approaches. And so what is the situation then? I mean, I'm saying it's a metaphor, but it may also be an identity, a real thing. I think that the times that bring us here into the Stoa, for which we're resonating, there are many timeless warnings in poetry and in storytelling and in epics that warn us. The Yeats' second coming comes to mind in terms of the situation where things fall apart and the center cannot hold. And yet we have our own centers that the Dasein, where we are in a sense of our own experience, is a center that must hold in a sense when things around us that we're making sense of are falling apart and are taking unexpected shapes. And so the framing of design and Dasein is, I have to credit to Thomas Wendt, who wrote a brilliant small book back in 2015, which he actually presented at RSD 5 at Relating Systems Thinking and Design in 2016 and gave a talk based on that. His approach to it is different than mine, but in thinking about those relationships, I think they really come into play when we look at approaches to sense making. And so the situation can be seen as an emergence, as the emergence of our own commitments to what's unfolding, in essence, what we observe, call attention to, make important to ourselves, is how we conceive of a situation. And it can create, and it can gain an identity in that way. As observers, we give it from our own meaning that we ascribe to a situation. It almost becomes an interactant, a living situation in which we're engaged with it and it could be there in the background, like a pet, like an experience, like part of our lives. And we recognize the hold that these situations or the situation has on our time and our culture. Like right now, there are themes and experiences and ways of being that we're very obsessed with over the last year or so. And so when we speak of the meta crisis, in a way that's a frame that takes into account those 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 different concerns, those different social, personal, collective, societal concerns, civilizational level concerns that are in that we are both meta to, but are also they're entangled in each other. They become a kind of a whole in which we can't see the parts as they interact with each other. They start to get very entangled and into a type of complexity like scrambled eggs that can't be taken apart. So I'm asking the question with design or ways of constructing, knowledge to improve our lot, and Dasein, which is our place in it, to see what can we do better in terms of the kinds of design practices that not just designers or design education that I might be involved with, but also all of us in the way that we can design the aspects of our lives, design our experiences, and design the participation in these concerns in our own, in our civitas, in the groups and projects that we're working with. And so we find ourselves in Dasein, in what we're thrown to be, in what we're already finding ourselves by our values, by our motivations, by what brings forward, by our word and bringing intents forward. And so we're living in that space of what's important to us very often. In that way, there's some momentum to the design. We are not, we are in motion. And this is, I think, key to the ways of looking at sense making, which I'll get to in a little bit. And so I'd like to now look back at my last talk. So last October, I spoke here last of the global problematique, going back to the Club of Rome. Last year was also the 50th anniversary of the meeting of the Club of Rome that launched the Limits to Growth project, and my it also launched the School of Systems Thinking and of what's now systemic design, that started with Hassan Özbekan's presentation of the predicament of mankind at the Club of Rome. That was the prospectus that the Forrester and Donella Meadows Limits to Growth team and Özbekan's much smaller group kind of bid on and proposed. And so this consisted of these 49 continuous critical problems, which ranged from the increase in global poverty, in inequality and wealth inequality, of increasing destructive capacity of the weapons of war, of propaganda, of inadequate education, of insufficient institutional arrangements, and so on. There were 49, and in my courses, I sometimes prompt my students to see if they can even come up with 50. And there's something about being inframed with a set like this. It creates its own situation. It's its own mega crisis, in that they are all together and they're mega, and each one of them is a wicked problem. They aren't going away, they're continuous. We can ameliorate and deal with, and some will rise and fall. But those 49 seem to have an inframing effect. And I think there's something about the Dasein in that inframing, that we are overwhelmed by the complexity of considering those 49 critical concerns, and that they are continuous with us. So we're not passive in a situation like this, and we start to observe that these are real for us. We then have a choice of a certain commitment. Some of them may call to us. We may already be in action with respect to environmental action, with the peace movement, which I'm involved with, for example, with attempts to change foreign policy, as well as intervening in the weapons industry as a business model, and creative approaches to climate and the environment through working with local action, working with climate and environmental and strategic planning with municipalities, all these kind of different ways that my research or the systemic design approaches will work with commitments like that. Those are also can be seen like as a meta crisis, in that all of us may have from our own Dasein a way of saying, this is the experience I want to register in. This is the place where I can make a difference. This is the place where, in my case as a teacher as well, that my students can also engage in new economies, in changing healthcare processes, and things that we can educate master's level designers and graduate designers for in this kind of thing. But these are any one of these complex, wicked problems may be part of Özbekan's 49, but they are also part of today's situation. I mean, they're with us. And so I want to keep this kind of dialectic going in between the design and the Dasein, that as a designer who's living with an interest in making these differences and being able to kind of force multiply to expand what's possible to do in a meta crisis situation, is working across different communities, for example. So even going back to the Club of Rome 50 years later, there is a legacy that has continued. I mean, even tonight after my talk, early evening at 6:30, there'll be a presentation from the past at Systems Thinking Ontario. It's the second Monday of the month, and we have a Systems Thinking Ontario session, which has been growing online as we've been online for this. We typically meet at OCAD, and we've been going for about 8 years. And now, because we're online, it's grown in its capacity to bring in leading speakers from kind of the systems community, some of which are also kind of part of this tradition. So this evening that follows, I don't have to speak there, but Peter Tuddenham, a past president of ISSS, is speaking tonight on systems literacy. And some of what I'm speaking about tonight really touches on ways of learning a kind of a different approach to literacy and systems thinking, I would say, a systems literacy. But our discourse community that's formed since the Club of Rome time, in the social systems world, if you will, is a discourse community of dialogue, of dialogic design, and of intensive exploration of social systems for intervention and system change in those systems, using mapping and design research and multi-stakeholder engagement. So the dialogue and systemic design approaches with things like the systemic design toolkit, the different mapping practices called synthesis mapping, which we teach. And you can see some of these on my, this work on my blog and at work through OCAD and in published literature and all that. But the key thing here is that these discourses are addressing kind of these are different ways of attempting to kind of re-enter the situation, the continuous complex problems, if you will, and the mega crisis in ways that I think we have unique purchase in. So it's a Dasein, a tacit knowledge, a way of a commitment from the possibility of a commitment making a difference. And so going from possibility into action, and design is that action. We create, we create things, artifacts, approaches to systems, and changes within organizations, and by working with stakeholders, not going into the system itself, but working with the people who live in that system, working with them in their Dasein, if you'd say, that they are bringing their commitments into the center. And so we're of service in that way. So design is a service context, and there may be different ways that as joining me this evening, are seeing ways in which that your own skills can be engaged in a type of design, whether it's design for a type of change or from a designerly perspective, where we bring different design skills into the mix to create high-end visualizations or new artifacts or books and materials and workshops and such. So there's this interest in the systemic approach to design and dealing with working with the situation in which we respond to the contours, the dynamics, the emergence of things, but we also anticipate very much a situation of anticipating how the systems within a situation will unfold and where we can best make a difference. We have limited time and attention and of course funding. What can we do? And so there's this constant, so these systemic tools, if you will, are ways of looking ahead in anticipatory reasoning to imagine the unfolding of these interventions into the systems. What is going to have the most leverage as well? So what smaller actions will make the most difference, and that can we do by inspiring through design practices? And yet we're thrown in the everyday concerns, and we've got this type of work, you can imagine, leads to saying yes to a lot of strange things that also all find themselves together. And so there's also a way in which life becomes complicated and complex and sometimes a bit chaotic. And this is how the Dasein experiences kind of the why, the throat, what, the bringing a motivation into this type of work, if you will, into capital W work. It's a thrownness into it. We are, I'd like to turn down more of these things, but there's already a commitment. And so there's already a commitment to certain actions. And at the same time, we're thrown in the disharmonies, so by, so I look at this approach to the design as a dialectic, as a way of, and this comes out of Fernando Flores's work, and actually going back to the 1980s with Flores and Winograd and ontological design, and in mid 1990s as well, kind of moving that forward into disclosing new worlds with his work with Spinoza and Dreyfus in a Heideggerian approach. So it's appropriate with Dasein to bring in this notion of disclosive spaces, or design from Dasein as a way of disclosing opportunities for co-creation and for how change might take shape. And so out of being thrown and having to act in a situation, it can really experience, not from a remove, but from an embodied sense, what kinds of disharmonies are prevalent, are available to, for change. I see this in the things I'm interested in anyway. So in peace and in new economies and in environmental action and community levels and things like that, that they're also pushed with all these what's called intersections very often, but I see as social forces at the edge of breakdown and edge of chaos that force themselves into the kind of purity of our concerns, the motivation that would drive working on an ecological, economic, or an ecological economy, from an ecological economics perspective, perhaps, but like what we call flourishing economies, or a new kind of localized or bioregional manifestations of localized economic context we're trying to learn, enable, for example. And these are taking shape not just because they're a good thing to do, but because the alternative is global neoliberal kind of takeover that is being if we want to talk about the situation, we've got really now a Hobbes's Leviathan is global, and it's a globalism. And so the response to this has been taking agency in communities and in commitments where where local action can be designed and economies can be constructed even, even in very specific contexts where they can make a difference in communities or in municipalities or in regions or small countries. Very hard to do this in large countries, though. Not seeing this maybe within the US, but not across like the US as a social context. But we're besieged by these social forces that really move these processes along. That's part of being thrown. So and so in the way we can see, in the way that we teach, I should say, in strategic foresight and innovation, also teach ways of working with systems change or social change practices and service design, or services within these complex, within social complexity, because the interventions might actually take the shape of, a healthcare service, mental health, a small business cluster, a bioregion, and those contexts that we can design, we can enable to design or work for, are things that take place over sometimes very long periods of time. So I'll consult, advise, and teach with the interaction of the system, or an integration of the systems thinking approaches with in a design context, in a master design program, for example, but also these are designing approaches, a designing disposition. So we could call that systemic design from the relationship of systems thinking and design, like in our annual conference. But then there's also strategic foresight, futures thinking, futures narratives, and design futures, and designing experiences so people can understand, get kind of an experience of what future scenarios might feel like. In our program, we've really prided ourselves since the formation program, 2008, 2009, on creative, engaged, unique designerly approaches to futures creation and working with stakeholders in these, in ways, and in traditional ways, scenario planning, the global business network model. I mean, they learn all the basics. So, for futures, social forces, the trends and weak signals. But we also, I also do this through dialogue. So I believe that in terms of social futures, it's important for us to work with the social forces as well, which is actually a different approach to this. So in terms of things like envisioning and planning and working with stakeholders who are the ones that we're going to leave responsible for the futures, we want to leave them with visions for their desired future over a long-term context, and imagine how they would design and help them with really working with the imaginaries towards those futures. That is, how do we get through the other side into new situations? You could say, but moving from here to into the future. But yet the secret I want to share with you, and I don't even share this that often in the program because I don't teach strategic foresight courses, but we all work with futures to some extent. But I find great relevance in history as futures. So in cyclic histories, in cultural histories, and in this whole areas of practice, which I want to kind of briefly touch on, because I think they inform how we experience ourselves as cultural agents and cultural creators in certain historical times. And so this also, gets to different both quantitative and kind of social cycle models. So historical social cycles have been defined by, and some of you may know several of these models, different quantitative or pattern or pattern-based approaches to defining social kind of social histories, cyclic histories that can help us understand what kind of time is the time that we are in right now. And so And so I've since kind of foreseeing the 2008 financial crisis, because you could see the housing bubble when I was in the US occurring kind of blatantly and being promoted by the government and by interest rates and manipulation. You just kind of see the crash happening in slow motion, first from the peak, then knew that there was going to be a trigger event, a financial dislocation. And so as I started looking into that, this would have been back in 2007 or so, realized that in terms of foresight, there are models such as the Kondratiev wave theory, long wave theory, which identifies these kind of generational level cycles of which kind of follow the 20-year generations. So the full Kondratiev wave cycle is about 80 years, and we're in a continuing winter that has been addressed actually in the U.S. by like Ben Bernanke, who actually apparently had gained prominence before he was Federal Reserve Chair, as saying that he would intervene in the Kondratiev winter by basically what's called helicopter money, but by the planned injection of incredible liquidity, which we're seeing now, or which we've seen over the last 10 years. So from the Bernanke era was actually that intervention. So watching that unfold, and at the same time seeing that Foresight and futurists were barely talking about this. Very few did, because it's kind of happening at the time. It's the current situation, it's not the future situation, right? But being able to observe the Kondratiev model, as well as Schumpeter, and then also the fourth turning. So the fourth turning is generational theory, and is based on the notion that after 4 generations, or you've got generational conflicts that create 4 turnings from which also kind of follow a wave of the increase in hope and positive well-being in a society to the different notable conflicts that occur, and a topping out process, and then a crisis. And so every 80 years, at least in the US or in the West, Strauss and Howe, and so so Neil Howe is continuing to develop this. So generations theory, or generation theory for the in what's basically, you can just look up the fourth turning, and the whole idea of this model that was actually written up in 1990s, in mid 90s, and the book came out in 97, predicted a lot of what we're seeing now. I mean, not point by point, but the types of crises, the types of reactions, what's called the hero generation, which was mapped to the rise of the large, post-boomers, the millennial generation being quite huge, and that there would be a collectivist spirit as opposed to the more individualist spirit of prior generations. And their theory suggests that the individualist view will come back, that the generations can kind of compete with each other. So as followed that, the artists that follow the heroes will be more individualist. But we're going to be in a kind of a heroic position, huge social change, social forces. There will be precipitating crises, and the existent in the very future of the of the republic will be at stake. And so that's a huge situation and a crisis. If you take it, even if you don't believe it, and then you don't have to believe. It's not a belief system. This is not ideological. It's an approach to pattern fitting against historical cycles with an underlying theory that relates to the fact that generations communicate to each other, and they also have certain, like Kondratiev, they also follow certain money formation, credit formation, debt formation, and debt destruction cycles that are also part of the crisis. So these things come together. And the reason I'm bringing them up is they're all part of the social forces. That's why you get populism isn't people just being angry that their future prospects are declining. There is a deep Dasein, a felt sense of the individuals that then collectively populize and make their concerns known. And so as populism started to really form and take shape in about 2016, it didn't come out of nowhere. I mean, we've had financial dislocations, we've had total changes to people's economic history or histories, presence, and futures in our societies, in the West in particular, where the non-West has actually been growing, has had more and more wealth grow that for the first time in hundreds of years, in some cases in China and Russia, and our official enemies in particular, but in the West, we have used certain approaches to try to deal with these social forces. And so the last one I want to mention is Peter Turchin's structural demographics theory. And this is probably it's the most scientific of them, in the sense it's economics, it's cultural evolution, but it's based on sociology, a close, careful, detailed analysis of histories, and the quantification of data from those histories in collaboration with other scientists. So Peter Turchin from University of Connecticut, originally a biologist, has really kind of formed this area also of cultural evolution, but of structural dynamics, or structural demographic theory, which is documented in his blog, Applied Dynamics, and in journals. And it's a very lively discourse community. I bring it up because you may have actually seen articles about, the man who saw the future in 2010 in New York Times, or framed like that, also in the Atlantic recently and in others. And so notably enough, if you go back to 2010, he was saying, kind of like in Strauss and Howe's Fourth Turning, that these same types of dislocations, massive social disruption, social unrest, the collapse of certain institutional arrangements and populism would be with us like full bore, like the 30s, in about 10 years. In fact, in Turchin's model, it's not this, he does have 80-year cycles pretty much as well, but they follow social inequality and well-being. And so, I mean, basically measures of inequality and well-being. And when those are at crossing with each other, as well at the same time that there's what you see in the last 10 years or so, last 20 years, really since the millennium, has been what he measures is also an increase in the number of elites that are prevalent within the society, at the same time that the populace is visibly and in a very public way, seeing their fortunes decline drastically, and at the same time that there are more elites and they are competing with each other because there are more of them. His theory is essentially that there are when there's what's called elite overproduction, it creates an inter-elite competition where you have more and more PhDs coming out of more and more top schools. You have tens of thousands of universities, and their business model is to actually not create better students, but to create more students, because it's more income for those institutions, which are themselves also at risk. So as the forces that are taking shape there are increase in inequality, which of course you would think would spawn populism, a decrease in well-being and then the very visible public interplay of elites that pay no cost or consequences, bear no responsibility for the choices that they're able to make, within a very elite favoring type of political economy or political system. So we're seeing that play out. He really nailed it, 10 years ago. So these are almost more forecasting models. They're not that popular in strategic foresight, in the sense that they're more historically based as opposed to envisioned and creative. Yet I think we need both. And so I bring that up because that's actually very much, it describes very well the kind of situation that also blends with and supersedes the meta crisis. So this is a big part of the situation that we're in. That, you know, how are we relating to this kind of production of overproduction of elites? Can you see that as part of the force? And can we design, you know, that's created in a sense populism and, you know, and as a wave in that response, in response to that. So I realized, yeah, I could talk about this all day, and I want to get to some questions. So I want to take that now into kind of systemic design, like what can we do from here? So given kind of those models, those approaches to, you know, that I believe that, you know, social forces, social complexity are understandable, that interventions take some time. We have to be committed to them. We have to work with them. So how can we design for this complexity? So I'll just kind of summarize the sense-making models that has actually have come up before. So I look at that, if you're familiar with the integral theory AQUAL model, where we can look at, there's actually there are 4 sense-making kind of schools of thought, plus Dave Snowden's, which I put in the center, because this is multi-ontology. And the 4 schools of thought can actually associate with individual sense-making and collective sense-making, and internal and external. And so we could look at those as being Brenda Dervin as individual, making sense of a situation that they're in, but they want to get out of the situation. They're looking for help. And so Brenda Dervin, kind of, in my mind, really the original sense-making theorist. Her work goes back to the 70s. You know, is this individual in the situation. You have Carl Weick, who was not far after Dervin, but was more of the individual as part of an organization, and collective sense-making is difficult. And so individuals may understand the kind of problematics that we're faced with, and may have an understanding of how to make change and how to intervene. And that is part of the sense-making within organizations. But yet, because they're in a groupthink, they're in could say a group sync from a systems point of view. You're actually in that sync is very difficult to break out of the mindset within an organization to engage what you can foresee from sense making, and we often just let events play out. And so, I mean, Weick writes about these tensions in collective and organizational sense making. You have Gary Klein, who is who writes about the data frame sense making, that we all carry a frame. So it's individual, but individuals within a nominal situation where you can change the frame of the situation that you're in. You can change the frame and then change the data. So this is what experts are able to shift their frame in sense making, and therefore kind of change direction, and this is a powerful design skill. So the Klein is similar to Dervin in some respects, but and then there's this kind of Google Xerox PARC school of Peter Paroli and Dan Russell, which is external and also collective. It's information, making sense of information. And Dave Snowden's approach is really, you can switch between those ones, or these, you don't even have to name them, but we can take different ontological, epistemological positions in making sense. And that's what we do in design without knowing that we do that, at least in systemic design, by organizing different stakeholder contexts and situations, engaging people so that they can make sense together in ways that can structure their commitments, their decisions, and then they can creatively take action. So the magic of design, if you will, is partly in getting people into the circles, getting the right kind of data where it's authentic to them, but they're also getting past all the you can imagine how difficult this would be to do in politics right now. But then getting to the places where we can engage in sense-making dialogue together, and then meaning making. So meaning making and then embodying those meanings using the making, visualization, and co-creation tools of design. And so at this point, we can then kind of like bring pictures to the situation, bring the observers into an understanding of the situation where then they can become, real actors in that, and in dealing with, all the other concerns that come together in those frames as well. And so I would say that we've done so. The word, the idea of the situation and the label itself actually comes from some strategic foresight work I've done with a good colleague from the U.S. Air Force Research Lab. So yes, as a peace activist, I also have worked with military and work with those discourses as well. We hope to. That's how you make change. And so we had actually a science fiction short story written for one of these dialogic design series, and we developed this concept of the situation as becoming real and engaging in the dialogue with us. So that's now published in the Defense Technical Information Center, by a small team of us who did that work in AFRL. And I'll just say that it was about kind of it was described so that people in dialogue could understand the potential future outcomes of a 20-year R&D plan of quality of advanced computing for understanding situation representation, where autonomous systems can make sense of situations and advise humans on things that are emerging anywhere in the world. So this is actually available. I've got the link. I think you can get it from my Design Dialogues site. I don't know if I've published it there, but it is, these kinds of stories are actually available, and you can see, how we're trying to bring some new life into it now. So I'd like to maybe leave it there. I've covered a lot of ground, and I could talk about design all day, but I just want to give you an idea of what this dialectic of designing for a complex situation, of engaging complexity in ways that involve design, and on the ways in which you might also be designers in these contexts yourselves. So let me leave it there for some questions and see what we might take from here.
Awesome. So start putting your questions in the chat. I'll call on you, and we can unmute yourself and ask your question to Peter. Peter, are you okay to stay maybe like 5-10 minutes after the hour?
I'm good for as long as, yeah.
Okay, cool. And so while people are putting questions in the chat, maybe I'll warm you up with one or two. I really like the cyclic histories models. And I recall Steve Bannon was into the fourth turning famously. And so,
I know, he kind of ruined it for the rest of us.
And that's sort of like my question is, what is your sense of like geopolitical actors, perhaps bad faith actors, using these models and sense-making tools and design tools, not to ameliorate the meta crisis, but to capitalize on it?
Well, I think that is actually the notion of the grand chessboard. And you can go to models like Brzezinski's grand chessboard, going back further 100 years to Mackinder's, Mackinder's kind of continuation of the British Empire into the heartland, which is essentially the great landmass from the Pacific into Europe. So that's why we've had the continuing battles over the things like the Belt and Road Initiative now with China, and in Russia's containment of their own space, and starting to create very firm boundaries around their sovereignty. This is a way of containing the heartland now, is like naval, so I mean, you've also got major changes in military doctrine. You have, what's called revolution in military affairs. There's this fifth generation, which is really, as it's called, revolution. That's dealing with everything from, changes that naval forces are going to be much less important, with the hypersonic missiles and the flexibility and programming and availability of missiles in many things like light craft and from mobile context and all that. And so you've got that at the same time as these changes in planning, that these old models of that had actually been capitalized on as, if you will, geopolitical system models for, well over 100 years. So Mackinder's heartland was exploited by Brzezinski's great chessboard, and these are all kind of called great games, right? And then there was the clash of civilizations, and so that clash of civilizations, which which Samuel Huntington published like right after um, the end of history, So the whole kind of theme of the right after so right after the fall of the Soviet Union and the publication of the end of history, immediately followed Clash of Civilizations, which was this just huge dialectic, and it's a system model, if you will, that goes back into centuries or millennia of the formation of civilizations around language and religion. And he's saying that's going to, and Huntington said that was going to be with us for a very long period of time. And so these models compete with each other, and there you can see from policies how they're exploited by the different decisions that they're taking, and that without getting into those models, just say that those are still active. I mean, Brzezinski's been dead for I don't know, 10 years or so, but the US government is still following, and so is Kissinger, I think, by the way, implicitly these models. And you can also see, like I was saying, Bernanke had done, I think he was aware of, the Kondratiev, the, Soviet economist, Nikolai Kondratiev. He was aware of these cycles, and he had published about intervening in the Kondratiev winter, and he did. And it kind of worked, but it's kind of can kicking too. I mean, we're talking large systems. They are not, that money isn't going away. We're now seeing kind of a really mega version of that. And now they have run out of tools because we're really at the peak of that winter. So, so you can use other tools then to foresee what might happen there. There's what's called a Minsky moment, which happened a year ago. Actually this week. Minsky moment is the destruction of credit when at the level of banks, and it's foreseeable because you can see the buildup of credit derivatives and things like the extension of credit into buying, extending like stock buybacks and the use of all the Fed's credit into derivatives, and then it starts to collapse. And that house of cards came down right before COVID lockdowns, like a week before. And so it was covered up by the COVID lockdowns. In my view of the way these models are understood, that, I mean, if I could see the Minsky moment occurring in January last year, I told my students in my classes about it. I said, look for a crash because I was trying to teach them about system models and the practicality of some of these kind of large system models, that a Minsky moment could be predicted probably after first quarter, after results were in, and that there'd be this, kind of watch your own stuff, because there would be this huge drop, like a sucking sound that would just draw everything into a vortex. The bailouts that you didn't hear about were at the level of $4 trillion in March last year, and they were claimed to be needed for COVID, but the lockdown had just happened. So there weren't any expenses yet on the COVID ledger. It was just the kind of the fear had been building, and so they used the lockdown to cover up the $4 trillion bailout of that Minsky moment. Now I think there's going to be now we're seeing even kind of the highest stock market indexes ever. I mean, what the hell? The credit's crazy now, and you see $2 trillion stimulus budgets now regularly. They've breached that psychological line, and so now that's what we're facing is these kinds of monetary monkey business. We don't know how to make sense of that is what's important to me, and I tell you, they do know these models and are using them as ways to make what I would say an inter-elite competition. One of the ways you get to be the better elite is you make better arguments. And one of the ways you get to win is making the arguments that stick, even if they aren't the arguments that are true. They're the arguments that can be used in a live player way to actually get the money to make the legislation to change the deal. So they're definitely working with these models. I mean, if we can foresee it, they better be. It doesn't mean it's good. I mean, it's usually not. I think it's to our disadvantage. I mean, they could see the populism coming, but instead of dealing with it honestly and understanding that the populism was a social force, it has been suppressed as if it's a political, um, as if it's this political nightmare. And that's because it is up against elites. And if you're an elite, you probably are kind of concerned with your reputation and the continuation of your position. And so it becomes personal. And that's why populism has not been allowed to play out either, is in the same way our recessions aren't allowed to play out. And I have a real concern for this as a social systems, person. This is where I feel in the pit of my stomach. I just don't know where we can go if we can't work. It isn't that, the models are true or not. It's that you can see that they're being intervened in a way that they can't play out, that they're going to become toxic, that they're going to break down, that there will be collapses of sorts that we can't predict.
Right.
Yeah. And I'm optimistic. So anyway.
I have a follow-up, but I'm going to close on that question. But I'll take in Joshua. Joshua, you had a question.
Hi, Peter. Thank you. This a wealth of information you've been sharing. It seemed like you wanted to really separate the, I guess, maybe not separate, but highlight the difference between a social system and other kinds of systems. Maybe that's because, like you said, you were a social systems guy. So back to my question, I guess, has to do with infrastructure. Now, infrastructure is needed for growth and stability, but it's also rigid. And how does that, not just infrastructures as far as our physical infrastructure, but also, I guess, what we were just talking about, or what you were describing as mental models that are also some kind of structures in our brains that would lock us into old ways of being. So how do we deal with how do you approach infrastructure in trying to create new futures for design?
That's a great question. Well, designing infrastructure doesn't come along that often. So for one thing, it's the construction of the ability to get in front of new infrastructure is, well, partly luck. And I've been lucky enough as a designer to work on several platforms where I can work from the formation of a complete platform as being the lead designer from start to finish on things. That doesn't happen so often. But I do know this ability to put in infrastructure that lasts for a long time, whether it's digital, electromechanical, which I don't work with, structural, or cities, urban infrastructure. And we have to realize that those are historical commitments that are going to be with us for a long time, and they shape not only our spaces and places, place making, but they embed values. And I think the places to change infrastructure or to change or to observe the changes in values. And so this can actually come through on a positive side with populism. So one of the thinkers I really follow that I like a lot, so when I talk about social systems in this way, there are a lot of philosophers who don't use that same framing, but speak to the same types of things, like John Ralston Saul. So in his Collapse of Globalism, which he predicted, he's always about 10 years ahead of the trend. He is a social futurist, and to a great extent, I think, a good one, and uses fiction and it's nonfiction. But in the Collapse of Globalism, he saw in 2005 what was going to happen. And so he suggested, and this is where it gets to infrastructure, that when this kind of populism happens, or nationalism, he said that nationalism will happen, resurges in nationalism in response to globalization, and that it will happen, and it can be. He didn't maybe, and I think at the time when you're foreseeing how it's going to happen, and when you're writing for a popular audience, said it could be positive or negative and both. And so he's been working on kind of positive nationalism with like his 6 degrees, and with like bringing newcomers into this kind of new Canadian multicultural mindset. That's a type of social infrastructure. It's a type of positive nationalism of the type that he wrote about in 2005, and the populism that everyone that entrenched political elites fear is the type that he said would be like a negative nationalism, or at least is envisioned as being a negative. And so I think and the reason I see it as I like to emphasize social systems in complexity is that the situation is complex and multi-complex in ways that it embodies complexity, and you can use complexity thinking, complexity theory. But complexity theory only takes you in design so far. Social systems as a whole tradition of designing in social systems with stakeholders. In a social system, you can identify the boundaries of the social system and identify the stakeholders very clearly, because a social system is a system in which both the whole and the parts both have choice. So the whole of a social system has choice in that kind of leaders or spokespeople for an organization. You'd have the board and the management team, or nonprofit, or political organization, or health system and infrastructure. They have social systems associated with them that make choices on behalf of the system. Then they have parts or people that are in the system. And that's the only system where you do have that. And so it's socially complex. But if we talk about it as complexity and complexity principles, it quickly goes to math, or it goes to principles, but it's very hard to design. And you deal with social systems, we can now actually go to Dasein, get commitments in that system where people have ownership, can construct, can proceed with history making. I mean, they can start to see what their role in the history of that social system will be, and they can start taking action in ways that fulfill their commitment. So that's a way of saying, yeah, we can work with infrastructure, but by way of values and working with the social system around that infrastructure and defining it well. So that even gets to the geopolitical question of Peters, that these geopolitical models that actually have theories behind them that work if you use the theory. I mean, it isn't that the theory's true, it's that it's effective. And that's why values are important in those contexts as well, that by changing values, we can change the operating theory, and we can get a more harmonious approach to foreign policy into global relations in a multipolar system. So Eurasianism, for example, is the competitor to the unipolar West. And it's quickly taken shape. It has its own speakers, it has its social system. So this is, we're going to see infrastructure like the Belt and Road forming quickly with new values.
All right, let's take in Rachel Haywire.
Hi, Rachel.
Hey, good to see you, Peter. Big fan of your work. I have a question about design in terms of metapolitical systems. I know you're familiar with Julian and I guess the political architecture, you could call it. So I was curious if you thought there was an opportunity for artists to design a new political system in this current age, and if so, how that would be done.
That's a beautiful question. I really, going back to who first inspired me in this direction of going away from, so I used to do a lot of systems engineering in the 90s. And so I still worked with things like the military or with digital infrastructure. But at that same time, when I was getting my doctorate, I was taking, I was in Jean Houston's workshops, and she was championing this idea of social artistry. And so there's a way in which like social system designers can work artistically and engage artists. So it isn't just, we do a lot of sketching, bring sketch artists in and do live sketching. That's like an easy thing, but actually artists engaging politically and in co-creative ways with social systems as change processes, I think is essential. And we miss it as designers because, well, I wouldn't say we miss it. We have difficulty in engaging artists because they aren't already in within the boundaries of the social system. They're like, oh, why'd you bring in you're bringing in artists to make it fun or whatever. There's a way in which that framing really needs to happen. And like if I'm working with a bank, maybe not, but when I'm working with municipalities, for sure. I mean, so it depends on the, I mean, maybe this will change with the banks too. But there are communities and contexts that I work with, well, for one thing, with our type of designers, with their mixed disciplines. Like we have a team of one of my one of the teams in my systemic design course is working with an English bioregion in Southwest England, a bioregional project on what's called a fiber shed, which is like a soil to sheep to fiber to creation to local garment making and production and all, and the recycling back to the soil. This kind of whole, and that's very artistic. I mean, the whole thing is artistic, even though they're kind of like systems thinkers the way they think about it, I think. But my students are also, I'm encouraging them to think about it in artistic ways. But we haven't, I don't know if we have artists, but they're already starting to go in that direction. So I think there's, I don't know a better way to do that than to just make the invitations apparent and to start to like partner with artists in ways. So like, even like with fiction, like I was talking about the situation as being also written up as like a 20-page, 25-page short science fiction story. That's art work. And then it's also described by a visualization of a game board that describes that was drawn by an artist. So, yeah, we need to do more of that. Music, like, so Peter, my household loves the music you play before your sessions come on. It's like, oh, that's it's this mood. So yeah, there are many ways in which.
Is there a way I could contact you, Peter, about this specific thing? Because I wanted to share something with you and get your opinion on something. Do you have like email, website? What's the best way to get a hold of you?
Well, I'll find you in the chat, but no, I'm easy to find at OCAD, and anyone can contact me as a professor because it's kind of a public intellectual spot. So I'm. All right. So see how public that was? And now, oh gosh, now that's going to be on YouTube.
I'll edit it out.
You delete it out. Get rid of it. Get rid of it. I'm sorry. It's my fault.
Right. I always edit Rachel out anyway, so. It's funny. People have been asking, like, they've been emailing me. Can I get Peter Jones's email? And so I'm like, yeah, it's a Google search away.
Yeah, I'm pretty findable. There's designdialogues.com, and I think I can be found on that. But yeah, I'm findable on OCAD. That's why I'm not worried about that. We have good spam control on OCAD servers.
Right. So I'll ask maybe a real quick concluding question. Well, it's not going to be maybe that quick, but the meta crisis. We're having a symposium on the meta crisis. I think it's called "Let Us Maybe Make the Meta Crisis Our Superordinate Goal." We have 6 sessions, a lot of cool ones about the existential risk, suffering risk, environment, landscape, and I'm curious, any predictions that you have? I know it's a general question, or maybe to bifurcate that question, anything you think that like us live players of the STOA should particularly put focus on, or maybe something, the facet about the meta crisis that you're particularly concerned with or worried about?
I think this geopolitical question is interesting to some people. Others, it just puts them to sleep, or they're, or in my household, there are people that will turn on Battlestar Galactica and get the same thing from there, at least in a good story. I'll say that I think that the question of the future of civilization is compelling to all of us. And so in a sense, civilizations are formed through large scale power dynamics, which are social systems writ very large. I mean, when they go beyond the nation state into the world system, which is another systems theory I like a lot, Wallerstein's and others. I mean, there's a whole body of work in world systems theory, which actually Peter Turchin's work also interfaces with very well, which is on the formation of economic alliances in core countries and in periphery and semi-peripheral, and how those take shape differently depending on whether they're core or they've been operating as peripheral relationships. And so we've got big changes. So the meta crisis is, in a way, that these various stages of collapse, like the Joseph Tainter, Tad Homer Dixon collapse authors, Dmitry Orlov, they're all kind of right. I mean, they're all kind of writing right now, or at least Orlov is, like, see, I told you so. And what Orlov was saying is that with the US, I mean, in his model, which follows the Soviet Union, said cultural collapse goes last. He said the US, my God, it was first. And, you know, so they're updating their own models, but they are suggesting that these kinds of frames could be very helpful for us to not bemoan and lament, but to actually get ahead of the dynamics and be able to, I mean, this is why I'm optimistic. This is the first time in history, I think, people have been able to talk about this outside of like some closed room with invited, you know, Kissinger types or whatever. I mean, this is for hours to create. And I think the STOA is like, because it's not anti-elite. I mean, you have Noam Chomsky on here. But it's non-elite. It's not necessarily, it's counter elite in that way. And so is Noam Chomsky. Professor Chomsky is kind of counter elite, but he is also the most elite kind of thinker in his, you know, in that conventional space, ironically. So this is, so I would say these, you know, a space for these types of civilizational models, the changing of economic systems and what it means to us, but also the inclusion of discipline. So this idea from Rachel about, you know, if you hear me go, I could go on again about like McLuhan and artists, and, you know, why McLuhan believed, and I agree with him, that you know, that artists are those that actually do see the future coming. And when we don't have a space where we honor the artists in our culture, we've lost something. You know, we've lost something that we don't even, you know, that is unquantifiable. And that because there have been no major art movements that have captured the attention of the public, and in fact, we're even seeing like socialist art. In the US, it's kind of returning to like social justice art and stuff. And it's like, wait, it's kind of like goes back to the last great turning. It's like, we saw that 80 years ago in a different context, and it's not art, it's design. And art has to come from this Dasein, this place of experience and participation in society. So I think multiple disciplines that have been completely left out, spiritual, if you will, disciplines or traditions, you know, get more like legal people that are creative, people that are close to politics, people that are, and artists, and authors, and other types of thinkers. I think we need to have that weirder mix so that we can really pay attention to, you know, other ways of knowing, and to have in the meta is an embracing context where we can all inform each other around that. But I do think that there are some really critical issues in the next couple of years, you know, so we're in the middle of them now. And, you know, that's why I moved up to Canada. I could see some of this is just going to be very obviously happening. So left the US 15 years ago.
Beautiful. And we're happy to have you, my friend, especially in Toronto. Seems like a lot of intellectual live players are hanging out these days. Very cool. So I'll make some closing announcements in a moment, but Peter, always a pleasure to have you at the STOA, my friend. Love to have you back. And yeah, I do, just to echo that last thing you said, just kind of like more spaces where this cross-pollination, unexpected cross-pollination can occur between different types of thinkers or different ways of knowing, different artistic practices, I think is much needed. And as I mentioned, we have a Meta-Crisis Symposium on March 16th. There's 6 events. You can check it on thestoa.ca. It's an all-day thing. It's going to be quite fun. And in 45 minutes, Howard Bloom is coming to the STOA, 6 p.m. Eastern time. And this session is Everything you know about nature is wrong, the case of the blooming cosmos. So you can check that out, RSV on thestoa.ca. All right, everyone. Thanks for coming to the Stoa. Listen to some good music on the way out.